Well, I hope so. I'm not sure I will. I hope you're all sitting comfortably because, as Kerry said, I won't be using pictures. I've already warned Mike Monet here from Boundary Down that he's sitting too far to the front and he's going to get a pain in his neck. Kerry also mentioned about the seating arrangements. I once made the mistake of speaking to a crowded audience in a church hall and said, I hope you can see me at the back. And a voice came out saying, I can see you, but I'll gladly swap with someone who can't. How many CCS conferences have you attended? I've attended, 15, 20. The CCS community is really very good at speaking to itself. It's absolutely useless at influencing the people who take the decisions that could bring CCS into deployment. This may be my final conference. Last time I speak about CCS. Might be. So I want to begin by apologizing to you in case by the end of my remarks you don't feel personally insulted. I like to be inclusive and I don't want anyone to feel left out. Our approach is very relaxed, don't you think? As though we had all the time in the world. I don't think I've ever really experienced a sense of urgency at one of our events. Nothing, anyway, that comes close to that of climate change protesters in London and elsewhere, or indeed outside schools. The name is very apt. Extinction Rebellion. Extinction. That sums up a proper sense of crisis. Carries with it an acute need for urgency. Should hold that word in your minds. At most of these gatherings, we discuss promising developments and interesting research. The bad times are over. The importance of CCS is at last being recognized. Or so we tell ourselves. And it's much more cheery than to talk ourselves up than to push ourselves down. It feels so much better than bursting into tears. But if you believe that capturing and storing carbon dioxide on a huge scale is going to be absolutely essential if we're to curb global warming, then maybe the tears are more appropriate, because there's nothing to be cheerful about. I'm a Brit. That makes me even less cheerful. In the nightmare world of Brexit, it means that I'm only a semi-European, which is a pity because there are many good CCS projects in our country. I'm standing for election again to the European Parliament, rather unexpectedly, in 2 weeks' time, Brexit or no Brexit. So I'll mention in particular the HyNet Northwest project in my region. It wants to use methane reformers to create hydrogen that will provide energy for a chain of large industrial installations up the Manchester Ship Canal between Liverpool and Manchester. The CO2 produced will be stored in depleted gas fields below the Irish Sea. I think it's a great project. It's very cost-effective per tonne of CO2 saved, easy to deliver. If I'm elected, I'll be happy to champion it. Might do some other CCS things too. But in Britain, we've had many interesting CCS projects in the past. And with our track record, you wouldn't bet your life savings on the success of any of them. Now, proper Europeans will celebrate the Dutch government's inclusion of CCS in its climate strategy. And of course, we all hope that Rotterdam's Porthos project succeeds. It'll give us something to talk about for lots of conferences to come. After all, I can't remember the last time we had a conference where we didn't mention road, for example, so we need something to keep us going from the Netherlands. If Porthos does go ahead, then I wonder if every decision maker in Europe will then sit back and use the need to assess it for year after year as an excuse for delaying doing anything else. Elsewhere in the European Union, well, credit to Ervia in Ireland. For the Irish government, it may be a choice between funding CCS or getting rid of millions of burping cows. So the prospects must be good because, frankly, CCS is easier than upsetting a lot of farmers. I'm not sure that any other CCS projects within the EU have really been worked up. Of course, in Norway, we have Northern Lights. and the cement works and the Oslo waste plant. And in speech after speech, we make obligatory references to Sleipner and Snøhvit, where CO2 has been stored safely for decades. Well done, Norway. I'm fond of Norwegians. I can see at least one sitting in the room. I've paid credit to their CCS interest for many years. But it's been a long time since they made a serious commitment. Doesn't it strike you that Norway spends too much time complaining about the cost of CCS and not enough time remembering that the country is stinking rich because it makes shed loads of money selling dirty fossil fuels to us? If Norwegians want a clear conscience on climate change, then please, just spend some of that money on CCS. And elsewhere in the world, well, Japan is, as we know, carrying out studies. India, huge country, fast-growing economy, nothing worth mentioning. Southeast Asia, lots of coal power stations, nothing. Africa, big place, really big place, nothing. South America, nothing. Antarctica, well, you wouldn't expect much. Australia, not much given the money it makes from selling coal. North America, well, Canada. I'm always looking at Mike here. Please don't stop now. Oh, China, forgot China, the world's biggest CO2 emitter. Why is CCS in China always about to happen on a big scale, but never does make it happen? And then the United States, which thanks to 45Q tax credits is confirming its long-held position as the world leader, the genuine world leader. But because the president doesn't believe in climate change, nor in international agreements, the country doesn't quite set the example environmentalists might like. Now, what's the sum of all this? Well, where's John? The Global Carbon Capture and Storage Institute paints the most optimistic picture it can. It says that we've had a hiatus in CCS development over recent years. Today we have 18 plants in operation, 5 more under construction or serious development, 20 more schemes being talked about. But talking's not doing. Remember that word, extinction? Understand just how far all this is from what is needed? The International Energy Agency tells us that we need to be storing 850 million tons of CO2 annually by 2030 if CCS is to play a part in meeting its Paris obligations. We'll debate those figures, but seriously, look at the scale of that. 850 million tons they're talking about. 850 Sleipners. One a week, every week, for the next 10 years. If this were a 100-meter race, we're the athlete who heard the starting gun fire, only to slip on the starting blocks and fall flat on our face. We've just wasted so much time. Our record to date is one of failure. I don't really see much sign of that coming to an end. And CCS failure is something with which I identify personally. In the European Union, I think our greatest moment of success came more than a decade ago, when the leaders of our then 15 countries made a commitment to have up to 12 CCS projects by 2015. That could have been transformational. But our prime ministers never explained from where would come the billions of euros necessary to bring about those projects. Projects that would have no commercial value, but would be intended solely to curb CO2 emissions into the atmosphere. I became, a while later, the CCS rapporteur in the European Parliament for the Geological Storage of Carbon Directive. But my real claim to fame is to have brought or helped to bring into being a financing mechanism to provide support for CCS. And that became known as the NER 300. And when agreed at the end of 2008, we had hopes that it just might be worth 9 billion euros. In fact, as its value was directly linked to the emissions trading price of CO2, it plummeted and the value proved to be worth less than a quarter of that. 10 years later, not one single CCS demonstration plant built, or even close to being started. Not 1 cent of my NER 300 fund spent. For various reasons, it didn't do the job intended. It failed. My failure. Europe's failure. Most of us here, perhaps, share some of the blame for CCS failure. But we're not alone. You don't need to put on the hair shirts and whip yourselves. You hear noise from world leaders, but you don't see much by way of leadership. They've simply not woken up to the scale of the challenge. You see the figures. If we continue to emit greenhouse gases growing at the rate they are, then we're on course this century to see temperatures rising by anything between 3 and 6 degrees. Bit of a difference, that, isn't it? 3 to 6. Wow, what a difference. The Earth's warmed many times in the past, but it's never warmed with 7.6 billion people on the planet. People want to keep warm when it's cold. They want to keep cool when it's hot. They want light when it's dark. They want to be able to move. They want homes. The population of Africa could grow by 3 billion people during the course of this century. Then you have to need mega cities built by huge quantities of CO2 releasing concrete. During the lifetime of some of us here, certainly my time, world population has trebled. Continues to grow at 220,000 people every single day. Breathe in, breathe out, and the population of the world is growing. The driver behind global warming is this, and it has her foot on the accelerator. How do we run fast enough to keep up? How do we find the strength and speed not only to keep up, but to overtake, to get in front, to jam our feet into the ground and somehow bring the accelerating car to a halt, and then push it backwards? Where is Superman when you need him? Where's Wonder Woman? Global leaders have been talking about the dangers of climate change for 30 years and more, but most have done nothing to curb this increasing rate of emission. The targets we set always seem a long way off, and that slows the call for urgent action. But, 2050 is just around the corner. Many of you here, most of us perhaps, will see it. The majority of babies being born today will see 2100. But it won't be the same world. The scale of what needs to be done just seems incredible, even impossible. But it's not. It's not. Vast engineering and construction works are taking place of one kind or another around the world now. Remember, it's only a little while ago we kept hearing that there was a coal-fired power station opening in China every few days. We just need a good slice of the action. The technology exists, and with GDP globally expected to double over the next 30 years, the money's there too. It just needs leadership. It needs leadership to ensure that governments intervene directly, taking the initiative to ensure that transport and storage infrastructures are built. It needs leadership to introduce carrot and stick policies that will promote change, putting up the carbon price, introducing certificate schemes on fossil fuels that penalise emitters, providing finance for CCS investment, making sure there's a level playing field for European companies and their overseas competitors. The IEA says that incentives equivalent to 40 euros a tonne per CO2 emitted could trigger industrial investments that could lead to the capture of 450 million tonnes of CO2. There we are. Just introduce the right policy instruments, and this IEA says, frankly, this problem can be brought under control. You can play around with the figures, but, it's interesting that a body like the IEA is prepared to stand up and say, this can be done, and it's not unfeasible. We could see it happening. Frankly, most people's lives wouldn't change a great deal. Wouldn't be so appalling. All sounds pretty cheap to me by comparison to that big word, extinction. Whether you agree with it or not, the figure or not, the fact is we have it in our power to change more rapidly than we have ever conceived. We're just so used to projects being delayed that we've also forgotten the way in which just 7 words can sometimes cut through the Gordian knot of delay. In the past, those 7 words have been these. Don't you know there's a war on? Look at the transformation that took place in very unfortunate circumstances in America and Russia and Britain and elsewhere in the years from 1939, when a sense of crisis and urgency gripped those nations. Look at what economically they accomplished. Factories that were producing trains suddenly were producing tanks, Look at what happens when excuses are swept aside and nothing becomes acceptable as an excuse for delay. If people are convinced of the necessity, the challenge can be met. We need carbon capture and storage of one kind or another to reduce emissions from industries that make the products we want, we need. We need CCS to provide us with much of the CO2-free hydrogen that will heat our homes and power our transport. We need CCS to reduce emissions from the power sector. We need CCS to take CO2 from the air and from the burning of biofuels. We need CCS to compensate for our failure to reduce emissions in other sectors if we're to achieve a zero carbon target. Not quite so convinced that we need much by way of CCUS, but if it helps pay the bills, then so be it. So why haven't we persuaded policymakers to act? Well, you know what's said. It's not a developed technology. Oh, please, move on. It's too expensive. Well, just do the math. Compare it with other ways of reducing CO2 emissions from industry, even if they exist. Storage is not safe. Oh, sure, we all know that CO2 is toxic and explosive, don't we? That's why we drink it. These are arguments waiting to be made ridiculous by anyone who argues with knowledge and conviction. The real question is why politicians are not engaged. I suppose it's simply because they're ignorant and no pressure comes upon them from their voters. Nowhere in the world do politicians lose support because they fail to promote CCS deployment. Now in Europe, Brussels is at the heart of policy making. I'm sorry to say that there we've actually gone backwards. The last time the European Parliament voted strongly in favour of supporting CCS deployment was in 2014. I know because I wrote the report and led the debate. And since then, a few supporters of CCS in Brussels, like Jonas Helseth there at the back, have had to fight rearguard actions to prevent MEPs passing resolutions rejecting CCS entirely. It's madness. Climate change campaigners in the Parliament and elsewhere, parliaments across Europe, people who hold the IPCC reports to their hearts as though they're holy writ, seem to develop a blind spot when it comes to following the advice of the IPCC on carbon capture. The attitude of the European Parliament is reflected in the attitude of most European governments. So it's no surprise then that the European Commission becomes faint-hearted in its approach to CCS. I mean, how hard is it to push water uphill? A former director of DG Climate told me bluntly a year or so ago, Chris, CCS is off the agenda. Now compare our failure with the success of renewable technologies. For years, there's been a huge and powerful lobby for wind and solar, and the technology has advanced hugely, which is great. The lobby is sustained by those who benefit financially from the deployment of wind and solar. The people who make the equipment, the people who install it, the people who service it. The people who buy the electricity don't really care as long as the price is right. Now, where's the CCS equivalent? There is none. Political advocacy for CCS in Brussels is minimal and ridiculously underfunded. I could tell you the names of most of the people involved. In most of Europe's national capitals, there is no one, absolutely no one, arguing the case for CCS. Even in the Netherlands, even now, I know that CCS realists are under pressure from green evangelists who think it's the spawn of the devil. After so many setbacks, the potential equipment manufacturers just don't seem to have the confidence to make investment in CCS advocacy, even though there's potential there for them. And the people who might use CCS, the operators of gas power stations, the steel and cement and chemical sectors, regard it as a cost they'd really like to put off for as long as possible. They write reports saying it's needed, but they can too easily imagine European governments making demands upon them that aren't being made upon their competitors. You can have sympathy with that view. I have sympathy with it. No business is going to deploy CCS if it doesn't make commercial sense to do so. They don't exist to make a loss. It's the responsibility of governments to create a business case that can support CCS investment. That's what they did for wind and solar. The business case was called public subsidy. Where I part company from the industries that need CCS is with their failure to play a serious role in trying to change the political agenda. That's not so expensive. To turn your back on the biggest issue facing humanity, if you're a multinational mega company, is not to demonstrate corporate social responsibility. Take the oil and gas companies. They have expertise in transport and storage that will be in demand by CCS operators. And deployment of CCS can give a future for natural gas, even in a zero-carbon economy. So surely we belong together. Shell is the European leader. Even with low oil prices, or relatively so, it made the best part of $24 billion worth of profit last year. What is it doing in Brussels, or in any European capital, to argue the case for governments to create a business case to justify CCS investment? Shell's chief executive has just been given a huge pay increase. Big coverage in the Financial Times and elsewhere. By my reckoning, the company must be paying out more for the time he spends sitting on the toilet than it does in advocating CCS in Brussels. Or take BP. Its chief executive is paid, much less, 14 million euros. And the company has just spent a small fortune trying to improve its image. I read Politico every day, you see it every day. Making the claim in its advertising that it's open to a huge range of possibilities for technologies to combat climate change. Yet at its annual general meeting recently, its board argued against a proposal for the setting of long-term CO2 reduction targets because, and I quote from the board's report, it would risk a significant erosion of long-term shareholders' value. Well, there you are. Fuck the future. Screw the need to make a real difference. Let's just make money while we can. That's the attitude of the oil and gas companies. Let's just make money while we can and screw the future. What a bunch of shits. These oil and gas companies, these huge, powerful organizations, do you think they couldn't change the political agenda across Europe, across the world, if they wanted to? They could mount a Europe-wide campaign to influence decision makers and make CCS deployment a serious political issue without even coming close to the salary they now pay to just one of their chief executives. Some of their representatives are probably here today. Man, I don't want to malign them individually. It's just unfortunately that the corporate diktats to which they must obey are just so distant from the needs of humanity. I'm angry. Maybe you've gathered that. But you know that word extinction is still in my mind. I'm angry at myself for not doing more. I'm angry at others for being blind to the challenge before us. I'm angry at all of us for talking between ourselves and not getting out there to talk to policymakers and the people who influence them. But anger's good. Anger's good. Anger motivates. I hope you try it. Because you need to ask yourselves what you can do to make a difference. I've read the displays on the walls outside the room with interest. Sometimes I've even been able to understand part of them. There's really good work being carried out. It addresses problems. It extends what is possible. But what's the point of it? What's the point of the life's work of some of you if it's never going to be put to practical use? Your work, however specialist and detailed, needs to be used as a means of communicating with the ignorant. Policymakers. You need to be proactive. You need to devote time to communicating. You need to build into your program of work time to seek meetings with policymakers and policy influencers. You need to dispel the myths and argue the case for rapid deployment of the technology. If you have a project in, say, Italy, then make sure you're meeting with the next round of Italian members of the European Parliament and also Italian members of Parliament in Rome. I promise you, it'll make a difference. You won't get through every door, but many legislators will be interested to hear from you. You will change attitudes. You might even find another Chris Davis. That probably sounds really arrogant. But I became interested in CCS only because one person, back in 2007, talked with me and persuaded me this is something that, I really should take an interest in. And I ended up, for the next 7 years, being the person who championed CCS in the European Parliament. And since the voters retired me, no one has really taken my place, which is perhaps why we've had these problems in the Parliament with votes. And yet there were 751 members of the European Parliament. There's got to be someone out there who will be a champion, probably someone from the Netherlands. Don't look like that, Joel. There must be someone there. It's the number one country. And know that if you want to persuade governments and companies to change their ways, it's time to take off the gloves and fight. No more Mr. Nice Guy. You won't make much impact unless you start to challenge the way things are now. There's too many people in the CCS community who think you can get what you want by just presenting the facts. There are too many people who don't want to say anything controversial for fear of causing offense. I'm not one of them. You grab public attention. You stir up public debate by challenging politicians, challenging companies. Criticism and challenge doesn't make them reject what you're saying. They respond to challenge by trying to demonstrate, first of all, that they understand the merits of your case and are already doing something about it. Eventually, it might force them to actually do something about it. Challenge the oil and gas companies, for example, by saying they don't give a damn for the damage they do. And they will respond by saying they care very much indeed, and they give money to the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative to prove it. Oh, the OGCI. Utterly ineffective, don't get me started. The companies didn't set it up to deliver CCS. They set it up to deflect attention from their own inadequacy. Pure greenwash. Keep up the challenge, start the challenge, expose the inadequacies. Go public, talk to journalists who understand industry, use social media, challenge the politicians to explain how will they meet the Paris goals without CO2 capture and storage. Where's the action? Challenge the environmental NGOs that try to pretend that all our problems will be solved if we build more wind turbines and have unicorns jumping around them with batteries on their backs. Keep up the pressure, keep up the challenge, and do it loudly and publicly, and maybe you'll get some action worth having. There's no way in which we curb CO2 emissions by the extent necessary without the deployment of CCS. We cannot meet our needs without making things and capturing the CO2 as we do it. We cannot reach net zero emissions without capturing the CO2 and storing it permanently. Your work is vital for our future. There's so much to be done. You should be proud to be involved. I said before that a former European Commission Director General had told me that CCS was off the agenda. He did. But he added the words, but it will come back. It will. It has to. And all of us here should be doing what we can to make it happen. Thank you.